Welcome to Startup Therapist. I'm Jeff, and I'm thrilled to have just a fantastic and important guest today, Brad Feld. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Jeff.
How are you?
Good.
Good. Brad is based in Boulder, Colorado, and before I introduce him, for those of you, the few of you that don't know him, let me tell you that today we're going to talk about a pretty important and sobering topic, and that is the stress and anxiety that frequently accompany the startup journey and sometimes leading to depression. Brad's got a very unique perspective on this, both as an investor and a former entrepreneur. So that's the purpose of today's topic. I'm very humbled to call Brad a friend for, almost 20 years now.
Scary.
It's kind of sad by itself. And in a pretty crowded startup world, very few people don't need an introduction, and Brad is one of those few people. He's managing director, co-founder of Foundry Group, which is a very successful early-stage venture firm based in Boulder. He's got fantastic early-stage investments that he's made along the way, like Zynga and Fitbit and Lead Pages. Prior to that, co-founded another venture capital firm, Mobius Venture Capital, which is where we happen to meet. And prior to that, started a company coming out of college, built a technology company, which he sold later to Ameridata about 6 years later. And he's a graduate, both bachelor's and master's from MIT, right?
Yep.
Good. So thanks for joining that. Get that out of the way. Why don't we start, Brad, with kind of the sobering statistic, and I'd like your feedback on whether you agree or disagree with it. Last year, Atlantic Magazine ran a very prominent story. I think it was September, and they said that the tech industry has a depression problem. Why don't we start with whether you agree, disagree, and why?
Yeah, I think it does have a depression problem. I think it's worth noting that it's much broader than what people talk about. So I think many entrepreneurs struggle under immense pressure, but culturally, we're told as leaders and as entrepreneurs that we can't show any weakness. We have to be strong. We have to always, just power through. And the combination of our natural dynamics as humans and the natural chemistry as we deal with stress and anxiety, combined with this pressure not to show any of it, actually makes the problem worse. For anyone who's ever been depressed, you can identify with this comment when somebody says, "Oh, you're depressed, just shake it off," or "just get over it," or it doesn't work that way. It's not the dynamic. And so I think in the world of startups, there's actually a very deep problem, which is this lack of understanding of how to be vulnerable, of this notion that my friend Jerry Colonna calls radical self-inquiry, where you really are investigating what's going on with you as part of making you much more successful as an entrepreneur and a leader.
It would seem like there's so many contributing factors. There's a million things to do, little capital frequently, investors, a board of directors. What are the key contributing factors specifically that kind of start to build that anxiety and stress, potentially leading to depression for the founder?
Yeah, I think it ranges because as humans, we're all different in terms of how we respond to stimuli. I think you've described some of it. I would suggest that there's lots of other pieces. So, for example, I've had three significant clinical depressions as an adult, one in my mid-20s when I was running my first company, which was a very successful company, one in my mid-30s at the sort of apex of the internet bubble beginning to collapse, and then 9/11 happening. And then one just recently, a couple of years ago, where if you looked at it from the outside, you'd be like, what's the problem? Like, the dude's doing fine. Like, why is he depressed? And the example that I would give from my most recent one was when I came out of the depression and reflected on this 6-month clinical depression I had, a big part of it was that I was bored. And I was bored because I was approaching what my motivational dynamics were wrong. I've always viewed myself as being deeply intrinsically motivated by learning. And in this period of time, I had a physiological shock, which was I did a 50-mile race in the spring that I never really recovered from. I had a bike accident in the fall that was a near-death bike accident. I was fine, but like 1 inch the other direction, I'd be dead. I ended up with a kidney stone that required surgery. Right, so I had a series
of
health and physiological things that were all cumulative, along with working incredibly hard, being unbelievably tired, and not letting myself repair. But fundamentally, I was spending all of my time teaching and very little time learning. And what I realized at 47, 48, reflecting on this, was that I needed to link learning and teaching together as part of my motivational structure. And by doing that, I find that as long as I'm learning or teaching, I'm building up my reserves of energy. If I'm not doing either of those, I'm depleting them. And if I deplete my reserves too much, that leads to depressive situations. So it's not just stress, anxiety. And by the way, you can be very anxious and very stressed and not depressed. So they're different phenomena.
Right.
But I think the most challenging thing for an entrepreneur is to do that radical self-inquiry, to go on your own journey, to understand how you work, and to make that part of your own experience of being an entrepreneur, versus what so many people do is you block it out, you pay no attention to it, and then all of a sudden it just clobbers you.
Well, one of the things you said that was interesting is that it can be a very isolating kind of role. It's kind of lonely at the top for founders because they are meant to be these superheroes. If you can't talk to your staff, you can't talk to your board or your investors, what are some of the ways that you've seen founders or entrepreneurs find that release valve or others to help with that self-inquiry?
Yeah, so first and foremost, start with your peers. So having a peer or multiple peers who are also founders, who you can have no bullshit conversations with, that are confidential and private. Building those peer relationships are important.
Yep.
And there are structured ways to do it. Entrepreneurs Organization or YPO are great examples of them. But you can also do it in an unstructured way. But the key is that you have these emotionally intense, confidential relationships where you can be yourself.
We call it a consigliere.
Consigliere, somebody you can be honest with.
Yep.
Second, don't build investors and your board into one category. You might have an investor who you can have a deeper emotional engagement with. You might have an investor who views him or herself not as that hard-ass investor that's judging you and your performance as CEO, but as I like to say, my job is to work for you as the CEO as long as I support you. If I get to a point where I don't support you anymore, I need to do something about that. Right. And that doesn't mean fire you. That means at least deal with the issue, which could get us back to a good place. But as long as I support you, I work for you. You might have an investor like that. Might not be on your board. It might be one of your angel investors. But don't disqualify everybody so that you shut everybody out. Look for those relationships.
As a founder, I have found it to be difficult to be able to identify those people, to know who I can enter the danger with, if you will. And I think a lot of founders struggle with, you're a very rare breed, Brad, but for many VCs or angels, it's a bit of more of a formal, delicate relationship. How do you open that door or know if it's a safe place to have that kind of discussion?
I think it comes back around to this notion of your peers. Your peers, the more you talk about it with your peers, the more you'll identify people that you can have those relationships with, which, by the way, might not even be investors in your company. They could be investors, but they're investors in one of your friends' companies who's willing to put a little bit of energy into you and be that kind of resource for you for some kind of longer-term arc, right? Most investors are not, well, I shouldn't say most. Many investors focus on each thing as a transaction. The best investors view it as a long-term relationship that covers multiple things. I was an investor in, one of your companies. I was not an investor in another one of your companies, but, we're still in a long-term relationship. I think there's a good number of investors that think about things that way. That's very powerful.
But it's a minority of investors, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think you have to be thoughtful about who you engage with and what that relationship is. And by the way, recognize that it's very easy for an investor to love you at the beginning, because no investor is going to invest in your company unless they think it's going to be hugely successful. And then when things aren't going the way as planned, they can turn into, your biggest nemesis as an entrepreneur. That information is pretty easy to discover today. It's much easier to find that information, good and bad. In other words, you can say I'm a rare breed. I've fucked up plenty of things, and there's plenty of entrepreneurs in the world who think I didn't do them justice. And that's fine. Like, I'll own every mistake I make. And the key is to learn from and get better. The other phenomena that I think is very powerful in this, in terms of a search for who these people are, is building a broader community around it. So, Techstars is very powerful because we have an ethos woven throughout all of Techstars culturally Techstars the organization and the companies that Techstars invests in, the companies that go through the Techstars Accelerator, the mentors around the system, there's an ethos that we call give first. So this notion of investing energy into other people, into businesses without it being transactional.
Mm-hmm.
Another way to think about community like that is to think about executive coaches, right? The kind of work you're doing, the kind of work somebody like Jerry Colonna does with Reboot, where what you're really doing is finding people who have been through the journey and who have been through the journey multiple times, understand sort of the crucible of leadership and the challenge of all of this stuff, and are willing to relate to you as a human versus relate to you as a CEO.
Yeah.
And recognize that you can't separate those things fundamentally. It's easy to partition them, but you can't separate them. And engaging in that community as a CEO, putting yourself out there allows you to actually attract people to you.
Do you think, speaking of attraction, does the industry or does the startup journey attract people who are susceptible to this kind of stress and anxiety and depression? In other words, does it self-select the way founders are just wired, or could it happen to anybody that tries to take this very difficult, process?
I think it's more phenomena around leadership than entrepreneurship,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that it's embedded within this partly because of the thing we started at the beginning, this cultural stigma against depression.
Yeah.
Right? If you're going to be a leader of people, you have to somehow not be stigmatized, right? We can be leaders and have to wear glasses, right? But we can't be leaders and have anxiety,
right,
or have depressive episodes.
Your team doesn't want to see you; they want to see you cool under pressure.
That's right. And I think the problem is with that in so many ways is it's not about being cool under pressure. It's about being authentic in your way of being a leader. So I have enormous respect for leaders who, for example, are able to be vulnerable with their team.
So give some example, not necessarily the people, but what do they do that engenders that vulnerability, that connection? What tactical examples of what they do?
A word that has become a little cliche-ish, but is very useful, is this notion of transparency. And the idea of sharing openly with everybody in the company what's actually going on. Think about the CEOs that they don't hide anything. They protect everybody from, you don't need to see the financials. You don't need to know that we're out of cash in a month.
Right.
And by the way, I don't want you to know that we're out of cash in a month, because if you do know that we're out of cash in a month, maybe you're going to go look for another job versus be on this journey with me. Versus the CEO who all the way through has been transparent about where things are at. So everybody is on that journey with that CEO, fighting through it. When that CEO comes back from 2 weeks on the road, we're trying to raise money, and has 2 weeks worth of shitty meetings, walks in the office completely worn out and shredded and says, "We're doing great, don't worry, we're just about to close that round," versus, "I just spent 2 weeks on the road and it didn't go well. And here's what we got to figure out. And these are the things that I'm getting feedback on that we need to change to make progress. And I'm not concerned about our long-term future because I know our existing investors are supportive of us, but," right, just that level of clarity. And as Matt Blumberg, who's the CEO of ReturnPath, says, as the business gets bigger and bigger, it's not necessarily that you're transparent with everybody. He wrote a great blog post this morning on his blog, Only Once, where he says, when you're 10 people and you fire somebody, it's easy to gather everybody around and say you fired this person because they weren't performing. When you're 1,000 people, that's kind of just fucking cruel.
Yeah, sure.
You don't need to send an email out to everybody and say we fired this person because they weren't performing. It's like, actually, you're 1,000 people. Your cultural norm might not be to be,
that open, right?
And so you let that evolve over time, but it's figuring that out. The other piece, what can leaders do is, I have never subscribed to this notion of the demarcation between work and life, the separation that you have to have work-life balance, and that you have to have a separation between your work life and your non-work life. As an entrepreneur, they're intrinsically linked, and you can't rip them apart. I like the construct of work-life harmony, that the two things are playing with each other, and you have to let them play with each other over time. Well, if you believe in this notion of work-life harmony, sometimes work is going to dominate, sometimes life might dominate, but they're interwoven. That allows you to build relationships that are real human relationships with the people you work with.
Does that necessarily mean socializing and partying with your employees, or not necessarily?
It means whatever you want it to mean in the context of the culture you're creating as a leader. So there's not a single archetype. I don't like to go out late and party, so my archetype would not be one that you stay out late and party, but I like to be very emotionally accessible. So, when people are going through a divorce or somebody's struggling with a sickness of somebody, I'm able to be very emotionally engaged in that. But I'm not the one that's going to be out till 1 o'clock in the morning,
doing shots
and smoking pot, because that's not me.
Yeah.
But it's going to vary by person and by the culture of the company. And that culture evolves over time. When you're a 10-person company, you might have a certain style in terms of that relationship with the other 9 people that's different than when you're a 100-person company. As a leader, thinking about how to keep relating to the people as humans, not as direct reports,
right,
and not as a strictly business dynamic is important, but winding that into your own psyche. When you find yourself in a position with a leadership team where you feel beaten down, ask yourself the question, why? When you feel yourself isolated or shut out, ask yourself the question, why?
When it starts to grind, you got to pause and figure out what the problem is.
It's in you and in your control.
For founders to find this transparency, this vulnerability that you spoke about, does that need to happen from the very beginning and inception of the company? Let's say we have a viewer who's got a 50-person company and hasn't been living that way. Can he or she start to make that transition? Or if you don't do it from the very beginning and build that early trust, is the culture just never going to get there?
I think you can start at any point, and your culture will evolve and change continuously. And this is very, very important, is your values as a business. This is in Matt's post from this morning. Your values as a business are constant, but your culture evolves, and how you instantiate those values evolve. And we actually, within Foundry, we talk about them as deeply held beliefs. So we have, a set of values, but we have a layer, an abstraction layer, which are deeply held beliefs, and we allow ourselves to modify our deeply held beliefs over time, not tear them up and throw them away. They're deeply held,
but they evolve.
And then your culture changes based on the context of the company and what you're trying to do. It evolves as well. The idea that a culture is static and unchanging is as equally false as the notion that as human beings, we are static and unchanging, right? I'm 49. I've got a lot of characteristics that were the same when I'm 25, but I got a lot of things at 49 that are very different than when I was 25. Hopefully most of which are evolved positive traits. I'm sure some are evolved negative traits.
Yep.
And an organization goes through that journey as well. As a leader, recognizing you can't walk in and say, okay, we haven't been transparent up to today, and here's all the data.
So how do you make that change? If someone hasn't been living that way, that with that authenticity with their team, with their investors, and the light bulb goes on, maybe watching this video or whatever, how do they make that change?
Tactically, I'd start by defining clearly what change you want to make. So don't just say a platitude. Think about, in a very tangible way, what it is about where you are as a leader and how you're leading that you're not enjoying, or that is not nourishing you, or that does not feel right. Focus on it incrementally with the goal of building towards change versus drawing a line way out in the future and, yanking the steering wheel. There's a phrase a CEO I worked with for a long time used to say is, he would say, man, Jesus just yanked the steering wheel. And the idea would be that he'd be going down the path and all of a sudden the steering wheel would magically turn to the other side. Don't do that. People don't.
It's too sudden a change for people to grasp.
Be specific about yourself and work on yourself and have that amplify through the organization. I think the mistake so many people make is that they try to emulate somebody. Oh, I'm going to be more like Steve Jobs as a leader. I'm going to be more like, Larry Page as a leader. I'm going to be more like, Warren Buffett as a leader. No, those are characteristics that you might want to incorporate, but make them yours and focus on your leadership, and especially use the stimuli of stress and anxiety to help you focus on what aspects of your leadership you're not happy or comfortable with. Don't deny your own reality by thinking, oh, if I just change these things, I'll be better.
But it really means being vulnerable with your team, both your staff, your investors, your board. You really got to enter the danger with them.
It does. Enter the danger is a great phrase. But you can't be vulnerable with them if you're not vulnerable with yourself.
Agreed. It's got to start there.
And people protect themselves from that continuously.
We're almost done. There's one last quick topic I wanted to ask you about, which is this superhero syndrome. Many founders, because of the media, all they hear about Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Airbnb, Uber. And when you look towards those 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million situations, it's very easy for a founder to feel pretty dejected or a failure, even if they have a terrific outcome. Is that true in your opinion? And what can a founder do to not live in the shadow of those almost infinitesimal odds?
Yeah, so step one, recognize that this shit is really hard and most things fail. Number two, recognize that you're on a lifelong journey, not a single event. And then number three is focus on what is meaning for you in the work that you're doing rather than what you perceive as meaning for others. Just start from that. Use the examples of other people's success as inspiration for you, but not as a pattern or fact, just as inspiration, and then create your own path. I think if you start from that frame of reference, you recognize that every journey of success have massive ups and downs and swings. Every successful company I've been involved in has had at least one near-death experience.
You need to almost look at the moving average line as opposed to the highs and lows.
It's one big chaotic mess, much of which is a whole series of failures. Success is a whole series of failures strung together where you just somehow manage not to die, right? My favorite example of this is a company called Harmonix, which I was a seed investor in 1994, 95. And between 1995 and 2005, Harmonix tried to go out of business every year. If you know Zaphod Beeblebrox from Hitchhiker's Guide, they kept throwing themselves at the ground to try to fly and miss it. That's how you fly. You throw yourself at the ground and miss. And in 2005, they came out with Guitar Hero, and it was an overnight success. 10 years later, and it's just so hard, and these guys just stayed after it and stayed after it and stayed after it. And 20 years later, they still have a great company and great product. So it's don't get stuck in the soundbite world of success.
Yeah.
Recognize it's really hard, and that if you want to survive it, I love this notion of entering the danger. Don't do it yourself. Enter the danger with others.
You really got to enjoy the process, and if you don't, you're in the wrong business. Because
what's the point?
If you're doing it for the money, the odds are not very good.
That's right.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Brad. I can't thank you enough for the time today, and we appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
See you, Jeff.
Thanks, Brad. Bye.